9, 5 seconds, 1.
Hello everyone and welcome to the first lesson in our COP26 series. I'm Jenny and I'm here with Lewis from the Field Studies Council and Ed, who runs the Isle Farm here in Shrewsbury. Today we're going to be discussing the relationship between farming and biodiversity, and we're going to be challenging you to conduct your own investigations to discover hidden creatures in your local area. And together this will form a nationwide collaboration that will help to add to the discussion surrounding the relationship between farming and the environment. We're really lucky to be here on the Isle Farm today, and so I'm going to hand over to Ed. Can you tell us what is so special about the Isle Farm?
Thanks very much indeed, and a really big welcome to our farm here. We're one of about 210,000 farms stretched right across the United Kingdom. 3/4 of those farms actively produce food for the open market, and together we employ something in the region of 650,000 people. That equates to about 1.5% of the working population. And the amazing thing about that is that 1.5% produce nearly 60% of the food that is needed and consumed in the United Kingdom. The remainder we import. Looking back a bit, we've been farming in this part of the world, across the country, for about 7,000 years. And in fact, we've got evidence here that people have been farming for about, again, 5,000 years certainly. And I'm just putting on the table here some Bronze Age pot, which we've found across the farm. So that again is about 4,000 years old. And in fact, lastly, what I'll do is pop a little lead lion and some Roman pins. So we've been producing food and selling it for a very long time. And I'm just carrying on the tradition which people have been doing. So what we need to do is where exactly we are, what we do here, and why I think we're special. So what do we do? Well, we actually grow food and sell it. Our main crops are split into two areas. Firstly, you've got the arable production, and that's stuff that we grow out of the ground. And then, of course, we've got the livestock, or animals. So for the arable area of the farm, we produce three main crops. Firstly is wheat. So if you go and buy a loaf of bread in the shops, there's a very small chance, but a chance nonetheless, that actually the wheat started its life in the fields surrounding us here. The second crop that we grow are potatoes. And should you go in February, March time of next year, buy a packet of crisps, again, there is a chance that we grew those potatoes, that made those crisps on the farm here. And lastly, we produce, the last of our arable crops is something called maize or corn. And that goes as cattle feed for dairy herds who produce the milk. And that goes to a local creamery where they produce yogurt from that. So here we've got three products which you'll find in the shops which start their life here on the Isle. So where are we? Well, look, just find a map or Google it, find Shrewsbury on the map, and then go up and left of Shrewsbury, and you'll find that the River Severn does a loop. And we're right in the middle of that loop at a place called the Isle, as we've said. The size of the farm is about 860 acres. So to visualise that, that's about a square mile. And within it, we have the river running around. We've then got grassland and floodplains following that around. Then we grow some wildlife buffer strips. And then in the middle is, of course, where we have our arable crops, which produce the food. So what makes us special? Well, we were looking carefully about 12 years ago at our crop production, our yields, in other words, how much we actually produce, and also the biodiversity. And what we've noticed looking at the records is that we've had an amazing increase of crop production through the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and then that level of production has started to plateau off. So that tells us that we cannot sustainably support the amount of food that we're growing. The second thing which worried us is that we looked at the biodiversity, the nature on the farm, and within a living memory, so a very short period of time, we'd seen a decrease in the amount of ground nesting birds and also a decrease in insect life. So what we started to do was to look at the insects first and think, what can we do to help the insects? Because if we have the insects, that's going to increase the bird life. And very shortly it became apparent that actually you can't take just something in isolation, it's all part of the whole ecosystem. Many years ago there was a very famous Italian called Leonardo da Vinci, and he said that we know more about the movements of the stars than the ground underfoot. And the same holds very true today. And so we start with our soils here, and if we can look after the earth, look after the soils, we know that we can then sustainably produce food for the future. And so we've implemented a program of, rather than just sustainable agriculture, sustainability would be staying the same, what we try to do is do what we call regenerative agriculture, where we're actually improving our biosystems, we're improving our natural environment, as well as producing good quality food. And it's that program of regenerative agriculture which we have been concentrating on the farm here, and luckily many farmers as well across the country are doing the same, because the only thing that I can hand on to your generation will be good productive soil, and with good productive soil becomes a good productive biosphere. And if we look after our little planet, we look after our country, then we can produce good quality food and look after the ecosystems for many generations to come.
And so how can scientists such as Lewis help you with that? So Lewis, how are you going to get involved and help today?
Well, the investigation that we're going to be doing today involves trying to find out how many species are present in different areas on Ed's farm. It's really important to understand the diversity that we have in these environments, because every single organism has a role to play, and it's vital that especially the invertebrates, the insect life that Ed was talking about, is there to do the dirty work for us. So to break down organic matter into that fantastic topsoil that we grow our crops in, to eat the pests that prey on the crops in the first place, and to pollinate those crops. It's a bit like a football team, how it has a striker, a goalie, a creative midfielder. These are all very specific and different, diverse roles within a team, but they're all working together towards a common goal in the same way that the diversity in the environment does. Right now, there's world leaders sitting around a table at COP26 talking about biodiversity loss, public health, climate change, and these are all tightly interlinked issues. And by helping one, we can help another. And by understanding the health of the ecosystem from a diversity standpoint, then we can better tell Ed how to manage his land here.
And so when we say biodiversity, what does that actually mean?
That's a great question. So diversity in general means difference, and when biologists talk about diversity, they're talking about difference on 3 different levels. The first of these is habitat diversity. You should have a space in your worksheet to note down these definitions, which will help you give some context to this investigation we're doing. Habitat diversity involves how many different places there are for organisms to live. So how many niches there are for them to inhabit, how many places there are for each invertebrate, bird, mammal, whatever you call it, to reside. Another level down from that is species diversity. So this is usually what we think of when we say biodiversity, or a number of species that we find in a particular area and how they're distributed across that area. And then finally, there's genetic diversity. So this is how different the DNA of each organism is within a population to another, how deep and how wide that gene pool is from which evolution can progress in a way that is beneficial to the survival of the species. We're going to be focusing on species diversity today because that is a very good indicator of ecosystem health, and it will give us a good way of comparing two different areas. Within species diversity, there are another two different areas that we would like to study. Biologists love a good definition. So within species diversity, we have species richness. Now, species richness refers to the number of different species that are found within a particular region. This could be anything from a teaspoon of Ed's topsoil to see how many different species of fungi and bacteria are in there, to looking at the whole Pacific Ocean and trying to understand the number of different species that exist there. Species evenness is a similar measure, but involves more the relative numbers of each species within an environment. So if you have an ecosystem that has each species with a relatively large population and that are similar to each other, that is a highly even and highly diverse environment. But if we have one or two dominant species and the others are being pushed to the sidelines somewhat, then we're talking about a less even and less diverse ecosystem. We actually have a space on your handout as well for you to visualize these concepts. There should be two model flower ecosystems, and you can now or a little bit later you can discuss as a class to try and count the number of species that you see there, which would be the diversity, but also the number of individuals in each of those species, which refers to the evenness. And you can try and work out for yourself which of those is the most, has the highest species richness and which has the highest species evenness. They might not necessarily be the same one. So we're going to be looking at species richness in particular, and the way we're going to measure this is by using something called a pitfall trap. We're going to trap invertebrates in a safe, ethical way so that we can understand which species are present in two different areas on Ed's farm. And you're going to do the same back at home to see whether you can notice patterns in your environment also.
Brilliant. So are you guys going to go and show us how it's done then?
Well, I think we are. And just before we set off, what I've got to underline is, as a farmer, I need help from the very best brains that I can get. Need help from people who actually understand the broader idea of ecology. And we've got to draw on the farm a baseline where we're starting at. If we know what species richness we have to start with, then we can actually plot our progress as we go through the years. So that baseline study, like we're going to do today, is really, really important. And the amazingly interesting thing with you and your results, and it would be really interesting for me as a farmer to hear what you find, is that are you more species rich in your urban environment or your school environment or your home environment than I am on the farm? Because if you are better than I am here, it means that I'm going to have to change my practices even more radically than we already are, so that we can actually look after this planet and improve that species richness, improve that biodiversity, and improve that sustainability for the future. So I'm really looking forward to the results, and your results are going to be absolutely key to me, to what I will feed into the practices on the farm in the future. Shall we go?
Let's get digging.
Okay, so while Ed and Lewis are just getting into position to show us how to set these traps, I'm just going to remind you how you can interact with our lesson today. So on the screen now you should see the contact information that you'll need if you want to send in any of your questions. Thank you so much for the questions that we've had already. We've seen loads and loads, but do keep sending them in using that contact information that's on your screen now, and we'll endeavour to answer as many as we can at the end of the session. So we're going to go now to our field camera and see if Ed and Lewis are in position, ready to model that pitfall trap laying.
Great, well I think this looks like a good spot.
Okay. What I'll do is just get down here.
So what do you use this area for on the farm for?
So I mean, what we're in is a field which is going to grow wheat for next year, so we'll be harvesting this in about July time. And in fact, what you can see, she's just been in the ground a week or so now, and she's already pointing up through the soil. Now, as you can see, the soil around here looks really bare. We've just got a little bit of wheat coming out of it, but nothing else. And the reason for that is we've just lightly cultivated this to make a seed bed for it. But what comes down to is the most important thing I've got on the farm here for producing food and sustaining life is this. And you might not think about it, soil, actually I'm holding in my hands more life than there are people on the planet. We've got about 10 billion living organisms in here. We've got fungi, we've got bacteria, we've got algae, other microflora and fauna, and what they go to do is they work in the nutrient cycle in the ground. So really important that I keep healthy soil as a farmer to grow crops. And this soil is quite remarkable. Nature basically worked out topsoil, what we're on, topsoil millions of years ago. And nature naturally generates about an inch every 500 years. And the world is covered by about a foot, 2 foot of topsoil, and without that topsoil, life as we know it just wouldn't exist on this planet. So it's really important that we look after our soils, and I say the one thing that I can hand over as a farmer to the next generation is healthy soils, and to see all these bacteria working away in here is really difficult. So what we got to do is look for those indicators, insects, other species, to show me that we're actually doing everything right. So hopefully we got some traps you can set.
Yes, well this is going to be our pitfall trap.
So how deep do you want to put it in there?
Really you want it exactly as deep or just about slightly deeper than your container.
So it's basically flush,
yeah.
And so any sort of beetle or insect that's wandering along here is literally going to fall into it.
That's the thing, if there's a lip above the soil, the insects we're looking for are going to hit it and walk away thinking it's a bit of a brick wall. But if we have it flush to the lip of our container, then they should go tumbling in and we'll be able to find out what kind of diversity and species richness you've got here on the farm.
So that tells me is that some of the stuff we catch is going to be pretty small actually.
There could be some really seriously tiny stuff. The springtails could be 0.5 millimetre. Little mites could be even smaller. But that's part of the fun of it.
So again, if you're doing this somewhere else, if I should have a magnifying glass with me really to look at these things.
Yeah, if you've got any sort of magnifying lens, that's going to be really useful when we come to identify our species. But a few of them are going to be easily big enough to see without.
Great. And again, we're in winter, so it's going to be raining. Something tells me that if you're a beetle, you don't want to be swimming in the bottom of that. What do we do?
Yes, well,
what do we do about that?
In the past, they might have filled it full of chemicals for them to swim in that would have killed them. But we're trying to make an ethical pitfall trap here, so we don't want that to happen. So something you can do is improvise a little roof, maybe with a piece of wood or similar, and then use little rocks on the corners to stop the rain and excess undergrowth and things like that falling into our pitfall trap. And yeah, excellent idea to weigh it down in case there's any high winds later on.
Great. And how long are we going to leave this in the ground?
We're going to leave it overnight because those darker hours of the evening and the night are when our invertebrates are most active. It's when they're crawling around, searching for their prey, escaping from their predators, and we're going to check it again in the morning. Really important that we check it before the insects have a chance to warm up and dry out in there, even in these wintry conditions.
Which actually comes on to, here we are in November at the moment. When's the best time to actually go and set these pit traps, or can you do it all year round?
You can do it all year round. You're more likely to find a greater diversity and a greater number in the summer months when it's warmer, but there should be insects active all year round, and the really interesting thing is if you do it over the year, you can see which kinds of insects are active when. And that's one thing ecologists might do to try and understand the effects of climate change on these insects, see if they're starting to come out earlier, see if they're starting to be more active at different times.
Well, we'll leave this one. I've got a completely different environment, only 20 metres away from here, which when we get there you'll see has got plenty of vegetation on it and certainly no bare soil like this. Let's go.
Excellent, let's check it out.
Right.
This certainly seems a bit more
Well, this
wild.
is, yeah, no, location number 2. What we try to do around the farm is we leave wildlife areas around all the fields. And the reason for that is what we're trying to do is encourage the insects to have a really good environment to live in, but also to repopulate that first site that we saw. And so I hope that this area here is going to be much more rich in beetles or whatever we find in your traps.
Well, let's get digging then. So you say this is an area with lower human impact, lower sort of intervention.
Yeah, so again, this is a place which we purposely plant up. We've got pollen and nectar mix, so that's to encourage the insects. But also with the insects comes all the other wildlife. You've got the ground nesting birds, the birds, and in fact we've got, for the first time ever on this farm, some breeding pairs of hares, which is really exciting.
Little leverets.
And then last night we were out with a thermal camera and we actually saw some young foxes hunting across one of the fields, literally 300-400 yards in that direction. So there you've got your top predators, but the top predators can only survive if we've got the whole basis of the food chain moving up.
Exactly. That whole interconnected food web needs to be working properly.
Well, if it works properly for nature, then actually as farmers, as producers of food, it means that nature's working with us and we're working with nature, and it's just brilliant to see with it. But at the bottom line, of course, we've got to make money. So I need that site number 1, the commercial site, to grow food for people to eat. But then if I can lope in on the area here, these wildlife areas, make space for nature to work with nature, then actually it's a win-win situation for everybody. And if we do enough of this, we've got a sustainable future for generations to come.
And a way that we can be kind to the nature in our traps, because we're going to be catching all sorts of different things, including prey and their predators. They're going to be trapped in there together. We don't want to come here tomorrow and see a big predatory beetle fat on its breakfast. We want to see a good variety of different species. So it's a great idea, if you can, to put some leaves in there as a little refuge for those prey species, so that they can have somewhere to hide overnight.
With this trap, because we've got a lot more vegetation around it, do we need to clear this away, or is it exactly the same? We just want a lip so the beetles will fall into it, all as flat as possible here.
Yeah, we just want it flush with the ground. We're not so worried about the vegetation here, because obviously that's part of our experiment, is that here is a more vegetated area. They've got that cover, and if we change that, we'd be altering our experimental conditions.
And if somebody wanted to replicate this at school or at home there, again, what's the best way for them to do it so they get the 2 different environments like we've done on the farm here?
You could use anything from a school playing field, which is mowed regularly, to a treed area that's a little bit further away. You could have your well manicured garden, maybe go and dig up Dad's lawn, and then a little area next to a hedgerow that's a bit wilder and less impacted by human influence.
Oh, brilliant. So this can be done anywhere, basically.
Yeah, and you can use all sorts of things, yogurt pots, drinks bottles that you can cut the top off of, jam jars, Tupperware, really anything you've got that's got steep sides, nice and slippy, nice wide opening, you're golden. But I think now it's time we hammer in our roof. Would you like to do the honours?
Oh, yep. There we go.
Excellent.
Yeah.
And with that, we'll go back to Jenny in the marquee.
Lewis, thanks very much. Read on.
So now that Lewis has showed us how to lay a pitfall trap, it's your turn. With studies like this, results can vary hugely because ecology is messy and there are loads of factors that are difficult to control. So that's why it's really, really important for us to collect as much data as we possibly can to give us confidence in the associations that we're observing. You'll notice, so we're asking for all of you to go out with your family, your friends, your classmates, and to get involved and to set up your own investigations in your local area and send the data that you collect into us using the survey 123 link that you should see on your screen any moment now. You'll also notice that there's a space on your handout for you to draw a diagram of your setup of your pitfall traps. And it's also important to note down the variables involved in this investigation. So firstly, the independent variable in this instance is the land use or the amount of human intervention on a particular site. So as Lewis was saying, it's really important to choose two contrasting areas to set your pitfall traps up in. So for example, you might choose a manicured lawn or the middle of a football pitch with permission, and you might compare that with a hedgerow or, for example, under a hedge. The independent variable is the one thing that we're going to change. The dependent variable is what we're going to measure, and in this instance, in this investigation, we're going to be measuring species richness. You'll also notice on your sheet that there is space for you to note down the controls. To collect really good data, it's really important that we only vary our independent variable and we keep everything else the same. So some of the things that you can control would be the size of the pot that you use for your trap, for example, and also the time that you set your trap. I can see the guys are coming back from setting their traps now. How did it go?
Oh, it went fantastically. We've got our traps in now.
Great. Ready
to go. Although we will be taking those out and checking them tomorrow and then setting them again so that we can check them live on Wednesday.
Oh, great, exciting.
Yeah, so the really interesting thing now, as Jenny was just saying, is your data, and it's a really good opportunity for you to make a hypothesis about what we might find. So a hypothesis is a fancy word for a prediction, and it's essentially where you get a chance to take a guess, make an estimation based on your biological knowledge, what pattern you think you'll see. Do you think we'll see a higher species richness in the lower human influence area? Do you think there will be no difference? Do you think there will be more in the higher human influence area? These are all possible scenarios, but it's really important as scientists for us to think about what we think might happen and why we think that might happen before we get our results. Another important consideration that we've had to make on this, as I was just mentioning out in the field there, are the ethics of this experiment. Remember, we kept that little roof to keep all of the bugs dry, and we left leaves in there to protect prey insects from being predated overnight. These are just some of the ethical considerations we've made, and it's important to write these down in your workbooks to show that we've considered all of these things. Something I didn't mention while I was down in the field was how we release our insects. We've got to be ethical in that as well. they have a particular habitat that they live in, a particular role to play. So we need to make sure we return them to that same place that we found them, and to do it gently. Just when you look at your creatures, maybe take something like a nice white tray, something like that, to empty them into and count them, and then use that same tray to gently tip them out in the area where you found them. A paintbrush can help to get any Klingons.
So what kind of species do you reckon we're going to find in these traps?
Ooh, could be all sorts. That's what's so exciting about it. You never know what you're going to get. I'd love to see some predatory beetles. There's a lot of ladybirds out around now trying to find some places to hibernate, or even ground beetles, which eat slugs and snails to help Ed out with his crops. We might also find some cryptozoans, which isn't a Bitcoin bug. It's a Greek word meaning hidden animals. These are all of the creepy crawlies that live in dark, moist places like centipedes, millipedes, earwigs and that sort of thing. So I'm hoping we should get a good variety of those.
Great. And so a question for you, Ed. How are you enhancing the biodiversity already on your farm?
Wow, that's quite a question to answer, and it's a difficult one, but a simple one as well. And actually, I'm just going to go back to Lewis and his beetles there. Beetles are an amazing creature to look at, because firstly, we can catch them in the pitfalls. Secondly, we can actually see them, which is good. And if you're an alien coming down to the Earth and you wanted to study all life, beetles, which make up about 40% of the insect population, or insect species should I say, 40%, have inhabited all the different niches right the way through to little things eating microscopic bits and pieces, right the way up to sort of flesh-eating carnivorous type beetles. And that happens in our 4,000 species we have here in the UK. So I'm really keen to see it. But to go back to the question was, what can we do here? And as you all know, there's two types of agriculture. On the one side, we've got the organic, and the other side, we got fully commercial, using chemicals and bottles and bags and technology to produce food. Now, the organic boys and girls will say, and quite rightly, we've got to really look after the planet carefully if we're to survive. The commercial girls and boys will say, on the other hand, that look, if we don't use technology, we're going to starve. And what we try to do on the farm here is to bring the very best of the two ideas and bring them together by degrees. So we're lowering our impact on the planet, but we're also using the very best technology that we can to actually do that and produce good quality food for people. And I'm going to actually use this as a prop, and I'm going to ask for your imagination. So imagine that this is a field. Running round the field, we have a hedgerow. And then next to the hedgerow, we have what we call a buffer strip. And that's just a wild bit of grassland that I leave. And then in the centre here, we have our commercial crop. And the idea here is that we get all the species-rich environment in the hedgerow and the grassland round the field. And then our crop, it could be wheat, it could be potatoes, it could be maize, it could be leeks, it could be carrots, whatever the crop is in the middle there. And what we're doing is trying to increase our biodiversity so that we've got the wildlife all living around the crop, and it will actually infiltrate into our crop here and allow that species richment. Now, in the crop, we might have a real problem, and that's going to be the little red roses you can see here. So say we have a problem caused by a fungal infection, or in fact an aphid, a type of fly, and that could cause real problems to me in getting my growing it and actually producing it. So in the old days, what we'd do 40 years ago is if we'd identify a problem, we'd then run a sprayer across the field and spray the whole field against aphids or rust, a fungal infection. Now today what we use is technology, and so we found the problem there. What we can do then is identify the exact locations that it is And instead of actually putting a fungicide or an insecticide to protect the crop right across the field, we just target that one area there where we've got the problem. It'd be much nicer not to use these chemicals, but unless we do, we'd have a real problem with actually producing the food that we all need to eat. So we can do two things to get around the problem there. One is actually we put diversification within the crop itself. So if you imagine the genetics of a mouse, maybe it's that big, human genetics, the spread is that big. In wheat, it's right the way across. So you've got the Abyssinian wheatgrass on one side, and you've got the fat, plump grains that you'd be growing on the North Dakotan plain in America. And so what we take are 4 different varieties of wheat in here, and we go plant it in the field in the hopes that if one is susceptible to the disease, the others aren't. So we're using nature to actually combat some of the problems that we have. And if we can't use nature to combat the problems, yes, we do use technology. Yes, the technology does work, but it's a little bit like you and I taking antibiotics if we've got a toothache. Yes, we'll sort out the toothache, but the collateral damage we do is we also kill all the really good symbiotic bacteria within our gut that keeps us healthy and alive. And what we want to do on the farm is actually preserve that spread of genetics. We want to preserve that biodiversity. We want to preserve everything that lives in the soil and helps the processes in there to grow good quality food.
Well, great, thanks Ed. So now it's time to do a couple of your questions. Thank you very much for sending them in. So first of all, Lewis, is there a minimum number of species for a habit to be considered healthy biodiversity?
Ooh, that is a good question. Yeah,
the habitat.
So is there a minimum species for a habitat to be considered biodiverse is essentially the question.
Yeah.
That's really interesting because it's not as obvious as it might seem. You might think, oh, more species is better. But a lot of the time it has to do with identifying what is normal for that particular ecosystem, which is why, as Ed was saying earlier, it's really important to have these kinds of studies so that we can get a baseline measurement and understand where things are at right now. Because if we were in a scenario where more species is definitely better, then invasive species wouldn't make as much sense, because sometimes a new species can come in that's technically increasing the biodiversity, but it might be causing other issues to the organisms there. So it's really about understanding what's normal for that environment, what's been normal in the past, and how we can maintain that in the future.
Okay, great. And so is there, how can we help to increase biodiversity in our gardens or local areas, somebody's asking?
That's a really good question. So planting things that are beneficial to insects is a really good way. It's a little bit like a small scale version of what Ed has here on his farm. Picking plants that pollinators really like to visit, lavenders, hebe, that sort of thing, if you're talking about working in your garden. And maybe setting aside an area in the same way that Ed has to go a little bit wild. Maybe if you are a little bit obsessed with your fantastic pristine lawn, leave a little corner of it to get a little bit overgrown and allow that refuge to be there for organisms to inhabit.
I think Lewis has put that really, really well. Is again, across the farm, what we try and do is I call it untidy farming. Yeah. And what we're trying to do is actually leave space for nature, because without nature we're nothing. And as I say, if we can just actually grow that food, but also allow nature to do her bit, then actually we're in a win-win situation.
And working in harmony with nature and the environment.
Mm.
I think you've probably answered that with the last answer. So is invertebrate richness directly related to plant richness? You've kind of covered that one, haven't you?
They're going to be involved with each other in a way. They're working in a symbiotic way. That's why the diversity is so important, because there's all of these links between species that you might not fully understand until one of them's missing, and then it's too late. So they are going to be tightly interlinked in terms of pollination, in terms of pest predation, in terms of all of those ecological roles that we were talking about. Yeah.
And somebody wants to know, what factors decrease biodiversity?
Well, not doing what we just said, I suppose.
Yeah.
Not leaving space for organisms to exist. And as Ed was saying, these sort of intensive farming practices.
Yeah, if I'd jump in there, and this is, I think you might have realised I'm pretty enthusiastic about the soil. In fact, really enthusiastic about the soil, because that's what we're giving to the next generation. And nature worked out all the processes within soil to grow plants. So if you imagine you've got all your little businesses, you've got your butcher, your baker, your candlestick maker, the confectionery, and they all feed up into the corner shop. And the corner shop is what gives all the nutrients for my plants to grow. And one of the things that we've done with the cheap food model, which we've been running for the last few years across the country, across the world, is that we've flooded the market with cheap product. And by that, what I mean, we've used a lot of fertilizers, which we've put onto the soil, and that's what the plants have taken up. And that has not completely got rid of the natural processes in the soil, but what it's done is made them redundant. And what we're trying to do here, by using regenerative agricultural practices, is actually kick-start all nature's natural processes so that we're using them to feed our crops, rather than putting a lot of inputs which ecologically don't make sense, but what they do is help with the food production. So if we can rely on nature rather than those inputs, then again we are in a win-win situation. But what we've got to produce is plentiful, affordable food. That's the equation we've got to balance.
And that links us back really well to our investigation inquiry question, that we're looking at whether more human influence could have a negative impact on biodiversity, and whether sitting back a little bit and allowing nature to take its course, allowing these natural processes to work, could encourage an increase in biodiversity. So I suppose we might find out from everyone's results back at home exactly what allows biodiversity to flourish.
Yeah, exactly. So, well, that's all we've got time for today. Do keep those questions coming in, and we will hopefully answer some more of those on Wednesday. Thank you so much for joining us. Please do get involved and have a go at those investigations at home or at school, and don't forget to send us in your data so that we can have a look at it all together on Wednesday. As Lewis was saying, we are going to be setting our traps tomorrow so that we can have a look and see what results we find live with you on Wednesday morning. So don't forget to tune in at 11 o'clock on Wednesday. But until then, it's bye from me and everyone else here at Isle Farm. Bye.
Bye.